My name is Grace, and I'm 31 years old. 3 years ago, my mother called me 4 days before Christmas and said 5 words that shattered everything. I thought I knew about family. We don't have enough room. I remember the exact smell of that moment. I was in my studio, the scent of dried eucalyptus and fresh floral foam clinging to my apron. I'm a florist. My hands are usually stained with the green blood of stems and the dust of petals. It was 5:14 p.m. Outside, the Seattle rain was turning into a slushy, miserable sleet that tapped against the glass like 1,000 tiny fingers begging to be let in. "What do you mean, Mom?" I asked. I held the phone to my ear with a trembling shoulder while I tried to tie a silk ribbon around a wreath. The silk was slippery, elusive. "For dinner, honey," Linda said. Her voice had that airy, breathless quality she used when she was about to do something cruel but wanted to frame it as a logistical necessity. "And for the stay, Victoria's new in-laws are coming up from California. They're staying in your old room. And since we're seating 20 for the formal dinner, the table is just full. We figured you'd understand." "You're so independent, Grace. You always have been." The silence that followed was heavy. It tasted like copper in the back of my throat. I looked at the empty chair in the corner of my studio. "So," I started, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone much smaller, much younger. "I'm not coming home for Christmas." "It's just this once," she said, though we both knew that was a lie. "Victoria needs this to be perfect. It's her first Christmas as a married woman. You wouldn't want to ruin the seating chart, would you? It would be so awkward for everyone if you were just hovering at the end of the table." Hovering. I wasn't a daughter. I was a ghost. I was a ghost that was being asked to stop haunting the feast because it was making the real guests uncomfortable, right? I whispered. "The seating chart." "Good girl," she said, her tone shifting to relief now that the unpleasantness was managed. "We'll send you a box of leftovers with Dad on the 27th. Or maybe the 28th. Oh, I have to go. The caterer is on the other line." Click. I stood there for a long time. The heater in the studio kicked on, a low, mechanical hum that only made the room feel colder. I looked down at the wreath I was making. It was beautiful. Deep evergreens, frosted berries, a touch of gold leaf. I had made it specifically for my parents' front door, a gift. A piece of me to hang where everyone could see it. I let the ribbon go. It unspooled, falling to the floor in a slow, graceful spiral, landing in a puddle of spilled water. I walked over to the window and watched the sleet turn to heavy snow. The streetlights cast a sickly orange glow over the pavement. Across the street, a family was unloading a Christmas tree from the roof of an SUV. The father was laughing, holding the door open for a little girl in a bright red coat. They looked warm. Even from here, through 2 panes of glass in a street full of winter, they looked warm. I reached out and touched the glass. It was ice cold, vibrating slightly with the wind. I thought of my father, Robert. He wouldn't call. He wouldn't argue with her. He would sit at that table of 20, eating his turkey, looking at the seat where his youngest daughter should be, and he would say nothing. He would pass the gravy to Victoria's father-in-law and comment on the weather. His love for me was a quiet thing, so quiet it was practically silent. And silence doesn't pull a chair out for you. Silence doesn't tell your mother she's being heartless. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from Victoria. "Hey, Mom told me you can't make it. Bummer. But honestly, it's for the best. The house is going to be so cramped with the Millers here. You'd be miserable anyway. Happy holidays." She didn't even ask if I had plans. She didn't offer to host me at her new place. She just validated my exile. I felt a hot, stinging prick behind my eyes. I refused to let the tears fall. If I started crying now, in this empty studio surrounded by the symbols of a holiday I was no longer invited to, I didn't think I'd ever stop. I grabbed my keys and my heavy wool coat. I didn't turn off the lights. I didn't lock the back door. I just walked out into the cold. The wind caught my breath, stealing it away before I could even taste it. I walked toward my car, my boots crunching on the thin layer of ice. I had spent my whole life waiting to be chosen. I had spent my whole life believing that if I were just a little more helpful, a little more successful, a little more invisible, I would eventually earn my place. But as I sat in my cold car, waiting for the engine to turn over, the truth finally settled in my chest like a stone. You cannot earn a place at a table where you aren't wanted. You cannot force people to see you if they've already decided you're a shadow. Something inside me went quiet. Not sad, not angry, just empty. But as the darkness settled in, something else settled too. A quiet decision I didn't even fully understand yet. I wasn't going to be a ghost anymore. If there was no room for me at their table, I would have to find a different house. I thought about my sister, Victoria, the golden child. Victoria, whose wedding I had spent 6 months designing the floral arrangements for free of charge. Victoria, who never had to ask for a seat, because the table was built around her every year of my life. I had been the flexible one. If there wasn't enough cake, I didn't want any. If the car was too full, I took the bus. If the conversation was too crowded, I stayed quiet. I had spent 30 years shrinking myself, pulling in my elbows, holding my breath, trying to be as small as possible so I wouldn't take up the space someone else might want. And I had finally succeeded. I was now so small that I had disappeared entirely. The drive home was a blur of taillights and static. Every time a car passed me, the splash of slush against my windshield sounded like a slap. I kept hearing my mother's voice, not just from today, but the echoes of 20 years of logistical necessities. I pulled into my driveway, but I didn't get out. I sat there in the dark, the engine ticking as it cooled. My mind began to wander back, drifting through the hallways of my memory. Looking for the first time, I realized I was the acceptable sacrifice. I was 8 years old. It was my birthday, June 14th. I had been dreaming of a party at the local pool, with those neon-colored cupcakes and a stack of presents wrapped in shiny paper. But that was the year Victoria made the varsity. Cheerleading squad as a freshman, Grace. Honey, my mother had said, leaning against the kitchen counter while she checked her watch. Victoria has an away camp that starts on your birthday. We have to drive her 3 hours upstate. We'll do your cake when we get back on the 16th, okay? You're such a big girl, you don't mind, do you? I remember nodding. I remember the way my throat felt tight, like I'd swallowed a golf ball. I didn't want to be the small girl who caused trouble. I wanted to be the big girl who made things easy. So I spent my 8th birthday at my Aunt Susan's house, watching reruns of game shows while she napped on the sofa. My parents didn't come back until the 17th. They forgot the cake. Then there was the time I won the regional art competition in high school. I was 17. I had poured my soul into a charcoal drawing of my father's hands, rough, calloused, and tired. It was the only way I knew how to talk to him. The awards ceremony is Friday at 7. I told them at dinner. Oh, Gracie, Dad said, actually looking up from his plate for a second. His eyes were kind, but they were exhausted. Victoria has her solo in the winter showcase that night. It's her senior year. We have to be there. I can take the bus, I said quickly. The big girl response. It's okay, that's my girl, he whispered. Reaching over to pat my hand, I went to that ceremony alone. I sat in a plastic chair in a cold gymnasium, listening to other parents cheer for their children. When they called my name for the blue ribbon, I walked up to the stage and looked out into a sea of strangers. I held that ribbon so tight the silk wrinkled. I took the bus home and put the ribbon in my desk drawer. I never showed them. They never asked. Sitting in my car now at 31, the pattern was so clear it was blinding. My life had been a series of not enoughs. Not enough room in the car. Not enough time in the day. Not enough seats at the table. I finally stepped out of the car, the freezing air biting at my cheeks. I walked into my apartment, a space I had curated with so much care. There were plants in every corner, velvet pillows, and the soft scent of lavender and old books. It was a beautiful home, but tonight, it felt like a cage. I walked to the hallway where a gallery wall of family photos hung. I had framed them all myself. There was Victoria at her graduation, draped in cords and honors. There was the big family photo from 3 years ago. Everyone was laughing. I looked closer. Was in the back row, half hidden by my brother-in-law's shoulder. I was squinting into the sun, looking like I was trying to apologize for being in the frame. Took the frame down. My fingers were shaking. I thought about my father. I used to think he was my ally, a silent partner in my exclusion. I used to think his silence was a form of protection, that he was just trying to keep the peace with my mother. But as I stared at his face in the photo, I realized that silence is an action. When you stay silent while someone you love is being pushed out, you aren't being peaceful. You're being an accomplice. I reached for my phone. I wanted to call him. I wanted to scream, "Dad, do you even care? Do you know that I'm sitting here in the dark while you're picking out wine for Victoria's in-laws?" I found his contact. I stared at the call button. Then, I remembered the time I had called him after a bad breakup 4 years ago. I was sobbing, barely able to breathe. He had listened for exactly 90 seconds before saying, "Grace, your mother is calling me for dinner." We'll talk later, okay? Hang in there. He never called back. I put the phone down on the cold granite of the kitchen island. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They didn't hate me. That would almost be easier to handle. Hate is an intense emotion. It requires energy. They were simply indifferent. I was a background character in the movie of their lives. I was the person who brought the flowers, who took the photos, who handled the awkward logistics of being missing. I walked over to my trash can. I took that framed family photo, the one where I was half hidden, and I dropped it in. The glass didn't break. It just landed with a dull, heavy thud on top of some discarded mail. I sat on my kitchen floor, leaning my back against the cabinets. The tile was freezing, but I didn't get up. I let the cold seep into my bones, had spent my whole life trying to be the good daughter, the easy daughter, the independent daughter, and all it had gotten me was a Christmas, alone in a dark apartment. Sat in my apartment as the sun went down, watching the shadows stretch across my floor. My father had a chance to choose me, and he chose silence instead. Christmas Eve arrived not with a bang, but with a suffocating, hollow silence. I woke up to the sound of a snowplow scraping. The street outside, a lonely, metallic shriek that echoed the state of my chest. Usually, the holidays in my apartment were a flurry of activity. I'd be finishing centerpieces for clients, the air thick with the scent of pine needles and cinnamon. But this year I had closed the shop early. I couldn't bear to handle one more family gathering, bouquet, or a thank you for hosting arrangement. I stayed in bed until noon. The sheets felt heavy like lead. I stared at the ceiling, counting the tiny imperfections in the plaster, trying to ignore the buzzing of my phone on the nightstand. I knew what it was. The family group chat was exploding. Finally, I reached for it. Victoria. OMG, the table looks stunning. Mom, these place cards are everything. Linda. Only the best for our guests. Robert, stop snacking on the pecans. Those are for the salad. Victoria. Image attached. I clicked the photo. It was a masterpiece of exclusion. The long mahogany table was draped in white linen. Sparkling crystal glasses caught the light of the chandelier. And there in the center was the wreath I had made. My mother had taken it apart and used the greens as a runner. My gift, dissected to decorate a table I wasn't allowed to sit at. There were 20 chairs. Perfectly spaced. Not a single one empty. I put the phone face down. The silence in my apartment felt loud now, ringing in my ears. I went to the kitchen and made a pot of coffee, but I forgot to put the grounds in. I just stood there watching clear, boiling water drip into the carafe. I wasn't just sad. I was disappearing. I looked at my reflection in the microwave door. My hair was a mess, my eyes were rimmed with red from a night of fitful sleep, and I was wearing an oversized sweatshirt with a coffee stain on the sleeve. I looked like a woman who had given up. Is this it? I whispered to the empty kitchen. Is this the rest of my life? Being the one who isn't there? I tried to eat. I pulled a leftover slice of cold turkey from the fridge. Ironic, considering my mother's promise, and sat at my small bistro table. It tasted like cardboard. Every swallow felt like a struggle. I could almost hear the laughter from 3 towns over. I could imagine my father sitting at the head of the table, clinking his glass against Victoria's father-in-law's, while my name was never mentioned. Or worse, if it was mentioned, it was with a sigh of, Grace is so busy with her shop, you know how she is. I felt a sudden violent surge of despair. It wasn't the kind of sadness that makes you cry. It was the kind that makes you want to crawl out of your own skin. I grabbed the plate of turkey and threw it. It didn't shatter. It just flipped over, the meat sliding across the hardwood floor with a wet, pathetic sound. I stared at it. I was waiting for the door to burst open and for my father to say, I couldn't do it, Grace. I couldn't eat without you. I was waiting for my mother to realize that a seating chart isn't more important than a daughter. But the miracle wasn't coming. The only thing coming was more silence. I looked at the clock. 6:30 p.m., the height of the festivities. I imagined them passing the potatoes. The steam rising in the warm room. The smell of roasted rosemary and joy. I couldn't stay here. The walls were closing in, covered in the invisible ink of every time I had been told to wait. To shrink to understand. If I stayed in this apartment for one more hour, I felt like I would simply cease to exist. I grabbed my coat, the heavy charcoal wool one. I didn't even change out of my leggings. I shoved my feet into my boots, not bothering to lace them. I grabbed my keys and my wallet. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a destination. I just knew I couldn't be the woman crying over cold turkey on a hardwood floor anymore. I walked out of my building. The air was brutal, the kind of cold that steals the moisture from your eyes instantly. The street was empty. Most people were exactly where they were supposed to be, with someone who loved them. Got into my car and started driving. The windshield wipers struggled against the fresh layer of snow. I drove past houses with glowing windows, past trees decorated with multicolored lights, past a church where people were filing in for a candlelight service. My stomach gave a sharp, painful growl. I hadn't really eaten in 24 hours. My body was demanding fuel, even if my soul felt empty. I turned onto the main strip of the neighboring town. Everything was dark. The hardware store, the pharmacy, the local bakery, all shuttered for the holiday. I felt a wave of panic. What if everything is closed? What if I'm the only person in the world who is hungry and alone right now? Then I saw it. A soft, warm glow at the end of the block. A neon sign flickered, "The Hearth, open for Christmas." It was a small, family-owned diner I'd passed 100 times but never entered. It looked humble, with wood-paneled walls and golden light spilling out onto the sidewalk. Grabbed my coat. If I was going to eat Christmas dinner alone, I was going to do it somewhere with actual food, with light, with life. I just had to find a restaurant that was still open. I stood in the middle of my kitchen and I started to laugh, a jagged, hysterical sound that turned into a sob before it even left my throat. I realized I was waiting for a miracle. The bell above the door chimed, a bright, silver sound that felt startlingly loud in the quiet night. As I stepped inside the hearth, the air hit me like a physical embrace. It smelled of slow-roasted beef, yeast rolls, and the faint, sweet scent of wood smoke from a fireplace. Crackling in the corner, it wasn't a crowded place, but it felt full. It felt alive. I stood by the "Please wait to be seated" sign, suddenly acutely aware of my messy hair and my salt-stained boots. I felt like an intruder, a stray cat looking for a scrap of warmth. I almost turned around to leave, my hand already back on the cold brass handle of the door. "Well, don't just stand there in the draft, darling. You're letting the North Pole in." A woman walked toward me. She looked to be in her late 60s, with a halo of soft, silver curls and an apron tied over a bright red sweater. Her name tag read Eleanor. She didn't look at me with the pity I expected. She looked at me with a sharp, piercing kindness, the kind that sees right through the "I'm fine" mask. "I'm sorry," I stammered, my voice raspy from disuse. "Are you still serving?" "I know it's late." Eleanor reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear. Her hand was warm and smelled faintly of flour. "We serve until the last person is full, honey." "Just one tonight?" I nodded, looking at the floor. "Just me." "Then you're in luck," she said, her voice dropping to a warm, conspiratorial whisper. The best seat in the house just opened up. She didn't lead me to a dark corner or a lonely stool at the counter. She led me to a round wooden table right next to the fireplace. At the table sat an older man with a thick white beard and a flannel shirt, reading a worn paperback book. "Henry," Eleanor said, tapping the table. "Make room for Grace." The man looked up, his eyes crinkling behind wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't ask how she knew my name. I realized later she'd probably just guessed. I needed to be called something, and he didn't act surprised. He just slid his book aside and pulled out the heavy oak chair next to him. "Sit down." "Grace," Henry said. His voice was a deep, steady rumble like a distant train. "The beef stew is the only thing worth eating tonight. Eleanor gets heavy-handed with the salt on the turkey." "I heard that, Henry," Eleanor called out from the kitchen. Though there was a smile in her voice, I sat. I felt the heat from the fireplace begin to thaw the ice in my joints. For the first time in 3 days, my shoulders dropped an inch away from my ears. "You're a long way from home, aren't you?" Henry asked gently. He wasn't prying. He was just acknowledging the weight I was carrying. "Not really," I said, looking at the flickering flames. "My family is only 20 minutes away." I looked at him, surprised by his honesty. "What happened?" "Life happened," he sighed. "Pride, silence, the usual suspects. Eleanor and we've been running this place for 12 years now. We realized pretty quick that on nights like this, the world is full of people who have nowhere to go, even if they have a house with a chimney and a full fridge." Eleanor returned, carrying a heavy ceramic bowl. She set it down in front of me. Steam rose in beautiful, swirling ribbons. Beside it, she placed a basket of bread so warm the butter was already melting into the crust. "Eat," she commanded gently. "In this house, nobody goes hungry, in the belly or the heart." I took a bite of the stew. It was rich, savory, and thick with carrots and potatoes. It tasted like effort. It tasted like someone had spent all day making sure it was perfect for whoever walked through that door. As I ate, Eleanor didn't leave. She pulled up a chair. Another couple from a nearby booth joined in. A younger man, maybe a few years older than me, came out from the kitchen wiping his hands on a towel. His name was Marcus, their nephew. He had kind, observant eyes and a slow smile that made the room feel even warmer. Marcus makes the bread, Eleanor said proudly. He's got the healing touch, I call it. Marcus laughed, a low, easy sound. It's just yeast and patience, Aunt Elle. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the urge to shrink. I didn't feel like I was hovering at the edge of someone else's life. For the next 2 hours, the seating chart didn't exist. There were no golden children or acceptable sacrifices. There were just stories. We talked about the snow, about Marcus's failed attempt at being a carpenter, about Eleanor's legendary stubbornness. They asked me about my shop, and when I told them I was a florist, Eleanor's face lit up. Flowers, she exclaimed. The world needs more people who understand that beauty isn't a luxury. It's a necessity. As the clock struck 10, I realized I hadn't thought about the group chat once. I hadn't wondered if my father had noticed I wasn't there. I was sitting with strangers who felt more like kin than the people who shared my DNA. When I stood up to pay, Eleanor caught my hand. The tab is settled, Grace, she said. No, I can't. It's Christmas, she insisted, her eyes soft but firm. And besides, we're short-staffed for the New Year's Eve brunch. If you really want to pay us back, come have a coffee and tell me what flowers would look best in those vases on the counter. I looked at her, then at Henry, then at Marcus, who was leaning against the doorframe, watching me with a quiet, steady gaze. For the first time in my life, someone hadn't just made room for me. They had invited me to stay. I stepped out into the night, but the cold didn't feel so sharp anymore. I looked up at the sky. The clouds had cleared, leaving a vast, shimmering blanket of stars. I grabbed my coat. I had come looking for a meal, but as I walked to my car, I realized I had found something much more dangerous to my old life. A glimmer of hope, Henry nodded slowly. He didn't ask why I wasn't with them. He didn't give me a lecture about the importance of family. He just took a sip of his coffee and said, "Sometimes the shortest distances are the hardest ones to cross." I spent 30 years in the Coast Guard. I've been halfway around the world, but the longest journey I ever took was the walk from my front gate to my front door after my son stopped calling. New Year's Eve didn't feel like a countdown to an ending this year. It felt like a slow, deliberate inhalation. I arrived at the hearth at 10 a.m., carrying a bucket of winter jasmine and white anemones from my shop. The air inside was already humming with the sound of clinking silverware and the low, rhythmic thrum of conversation. Eleanor saw me and let out a whistle that made a few regulars look up from their eggs. Now that, she said, pointing to the flowers, is exactly what this old wood needs. Marcus, get the girl some water for those stems. Marcus appeared from the kitchen, flour dusting his forearms. He looked at the flowers, then at me, his gaze lingering just a second longer than a stranger's should. Anemones, he said quietly. The windflower. My grandmother used to say they protected against bad luck. I could use a little of that, I admitted, handing him the bucket. Our fingers brushed, a brief, warm contact that sent a small spark through the numbness I'd been nursing for weeks. As I worked on the arrangements, Eleanor pulled up a stool. She didn't ask me to work. She just let me exist in her space. We talked while I trimmed stems. I told her about the shop, about the way a single peony can change the energy of a room, and eventually, slowly, about the Christmas dinner I didn't have. I expected her to be outraged, to tell me I should call my mother and give her a piece of my mind. Instead, she just polished a glass and looked out the window. Grace, she said, her voice steady. Some people are like sandy soil. No matter how much water or love you pour into them, they can't hold on to it. It just runs right through. It's not the water's fault. It's the ground. I stopped cutting. The jasmine felt heavy in my hand. I spent 30 years trying to change the soil, I whispered. Then stop, she said simply. Start planting where things actually grow. Over the next few weeks, the hearth became my sanctuary. I started showing up every Tuesday and Thursday after I closed my shop. I'd bring the bruised flowers, the ones that were still beautiful but too fragile for a commercial bouquet, and Eleanor would give me a corner table and a pot of Earl Grey. I began to learn the rhythm of their lives. I learned that Henry had lost his first wife to cancer 20 years ago, and that Eleanor had found him sitting in this very diner, staring at a cold cup of coffee, and refused to let him leave until he smiled. I learned that Marcus had moved back to Oregon after a high-stakes corporate job in Chicago nearly broke his spirit. I got tired of building things that didn't matter, Marcus told me one rainy Tuesday evening. We were sitting at the counter after the dinner rush. He was leaning on his elbows, watching me sketch a design for a wedding arch. I wanted to make something people could actually taste. Something that made them feel like they were home. "Is that why you stay here?" I asked. "With Eleanor and Henry? They're not my parents by blood," he said, and my heart skipped a beat. "My folks? They're busy living a life I didn't fit into. Eleanor and Henry, they're the family I chose. Or maybe they chose me. It's hard to tell where the choosing starts and the loving begins." The word chose echoed in my mind. It was a verb, an action, not a biological default. As the weeks turned into months, the golden child drama from my other life began to feel like a distant radio station fading into static. My mother called occasionally, her voice always tight with a performance of concern. "Grace, you've been so distant," Linda said during a call in February. "Victoria is having a gender reveal party next month. We need you to do the centerpieces. Something pink and blue, obviously. And try to be cheerful, honey. You've been so moody lately." I looked around my studio. I looked at the thank you note Eleanor had sent me for the cheer-up lilies I'd dropped off when she had a cold. I looked at the small wooden bird Henry had carved for me, a tiny wren, because he said I had a strong song. "I can't do the flowers, Mom," I said. My voice was calm. It didn't shake. "What? Why not?" "We're family, Grace. We give each other discounts." "I'm busy that weekend," I said. "I'm having dinner with friends." "Friends? Over your sister's big day? Honestly, Grace, you're being so selfish. After everything we've done for you." I didn't wait for her to finish. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a fight. I just said, "I hope it's a beautiful party, Mom. Goodbye." I hung up and felt nothing, no guilt, no crushing weight. Just a quiet, cool breeze blowing through a room that had been stifling for decades. That night, I went to the hearth. It was late and the closed sign was already flipped, but the lights were still on. I knocked on the glass. Marcus opened the door, his hair messy, looking tired but his face instantly brightening when he saw me. "We're closed, florist," he teased, though he was already stepping back to let me in. "I don't want food," I said, stepping into the warmth. "I just wanted to see if the soil was good tonight." He didn't ask what I meant. He just took my coat, hung it on the hook next to Eleanor's, and led me to the kitchen. He handed me a warm piece of sourdough fresh from the oven. "The soil is perfect," he said softly. We sat on the flour sacks in the back of the kitchen, eating bread and talking about nothing and everything, until the sun began to peek over the Oregon hills. I realized then that the healing wasn't going to be a sudden explosion of joy. It was going to be this, a series of quiet moments where I didn't have to apologize for taking up space. I was beginning to bloom, not because I had changed, but because I had finally found the sunspring in Oregon is a slow-motion miracle. The gray, heavy clouds finally break, revealing a green so vibrant it looks painted. My shop was overflowing with tulips and ranunculus, but for the first time, the beauty didn't feel like a mask I was wearing. It felt like a reflection of what was happening inside my own chest. My relationship with Marcus had shifted from comfortable silence to a deliberate, magnetic pull. It wasn't the kind of romance you see in movies, no grand gestures or rain-soaked declarations. It was found in the small things. The way he'd leave a thermos of hot coffee on my shop's doorstep on delivery mornings, or how he'd show up at closing time just to help me carry the heavy buckets of water to the back. One evening in May, we were sitting on the tailgate of his truck, parked at a lookout point overlooking the valley. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming lilacs. "I've spent so much of my life waiting for permission to be happy," I said, twisting a blade of grass between my fingers. "I thought if I was just good enough, someone would eventually hand me the keys to a life that felt real." Marcus leaned back on his elbows, looking up at the first few stars. "The problem with waiting for permission is that the people you're waiting on usually don't even know. They're holding the keys. Or worse, they've lost them." He turned his head to look at me. "You didn't need a key, Grace. You just needed to realize the door wasn't locked." He reached out and took my hand. His palm was rough from the bakery, warm and steady. When he kissed me, it didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like a homecoming. It tasted like the sweetness of the bread, He baked in the honesty of the life we were building. While my heart was opening, my biological family was attempting to tighten their grip. The golden child's gender reveal had come and gone. I had ignored the 20 missed calls and the scathing voicemails from my mother about my cruel abandonment of the family. Then came the invitation to the baby shower. It was fancy, embossed in gold foil. Victoria's little princess is arriving. I was standing in the hearth's kitchen, showing the card to Eleanor. She was kneading dough, her movements rhythmic and powerful. She stopped and wiped a smudge of flour from her forehead with her shoulder. "You going?" she asked, her eyes sharp. "I feel like I should," I sighed. "She's my sister. The baby is my niece. If I don't go, I'm the bad one forever. That's the narrative they've written for me." Eleanor stopped kneading. She leaned over the counter, her face inches from mine. "Grace, listen to me. You can spend your whole life trying to edit a script you didn't write, or you can start a new book. If you go to that party, you aren't going as a sister. You're going as a prop. You're going so they can feel like a complete family while they ignore you in the corner." She took the gold-foiled card from my hand and set it on the flour-dusted counter. "The question isn't whether they'll think you're bad," Eleanor said. "The question is, does that room make you feel safe? Does it make you feel loved? Because if it doesn't, it's not a family gathering. It's a crime scene where they keep trying to bury your spirit." I looked at the card, then at Eleanor, this woman who had fed me when I was starving, who had listened when I was silent, who had seen me when I was invisible. "I'm not going," I said. The words felt like a weight lifting off my lungs. "Good," she said, returning to her dough. "Because Henry and I were planning on taking the boat out to the lake that day. We need someone to help us catch dinner, and Marcus is useless with a fishing rod." That Saturday, while my biological family was surrounded by pink balloons and expensive catering, I was on a small, battered pontoon boat in the middle of a glassy lake. Henry was wearing a ridiculous straw hat, telling tall tales about his time in the Coast Guard. Eleanor was sitting in a lawn, chair on the deck, humming to the radio, and Marcus was sitting next to me, his arm draped around my shoulders, laughing as I struggled to cast my line. We didn't have a seating chart. We didn't have gold-foiled invitations. We had ham sandwiches, lukewarm lemonade, and a sense of belonging so thick I could almost touch it. I watched Henry and Eleanor. They looked at each other with a quiet, seasoned love, a partnership, built on decades of choosing each other every single morning. They looked at me not as a secondary guest, but as a daughter of the heart. "You're quiet, Grace," Henry said, nudging my foot with his boot. "I was just thinking," I said, leaning my head on Marcus's shoulder. "I used to think family was something you were stuck with, like a birthmark or a scar. I didn't know it could be something you grow, like a garden." "The best gardens are the ones you weed," Henry grunted. But his eyes were twinkling. As the sun began to set, casting a long golden path across the water, Marcus whispered in my ear, "I love you, Grace, not the easy version of you. Not the independent version. Just you, all the space you take up." For the first time in 31 years, I didn't feel like I was hovering at the edge of a life. I was at the very center of it. I was safe. I was chosen. And I was finally, truly beginning to see that the beauty The transition from friend of the family to family happened slowly, then all at once. By the time the leaves began to turn golden brittle in the Oregon autumn, I wasn't just a regular at the hearth. I had my own set of keys. I knew which floorboard in the pantry creaked and exactly how. Henry liked his morning coffee black as midnight, with a single square of dark chocolate on the side. But with this new joy came a nagging, sharp-edged fear. I had spent a lifetime waiting for the rug to be pulled out from under me. Every time Eleanor called me daughter, or Henry stood up for me when a difficult customer complained about the flowers on the tables, a small wounded part of me whispered, "This isn't permanent. They can change their minds. You aren't really theirs." It came to a head on a rainy Tuesday in October. Marcus and I were sitting in the back booth, looking over the blueprints for a small expansion of the diner, a floral cafe corner where I could sell bouquets alongside his artisan breads. "I'm scared, Marcus," I admitted, tracing the lines of the drawing. "What if I wake up and this was all just a beautiful mistake? What if I'm just filling a gap until someone better comes along?" Marcus didn't answer with words. He got up, walked to the kitchen, and brought Eleanor and Henry back to the booth. They sat down with a solemnity that made my heart race. "Grace," Eleanor started, her voice unusually formal, "we've been talking. We've lived long enough to know that blood is often just a biological accident. But commitment? Commitment is a choice. We don't want you to feel like a guest anymore. We don't want there to be any doubt about who you belong to. Henry reached into his flannel pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. He laid it on the table. It's called adult adoption, Henry said, his voice gravelly but thick with emotion. It's a legal process. It won't change who your birth parents are on paper, but it will make you, legally and eternally, our daughter, our heir, our family, permanently. I stared at the envelope. My breath hitched. I thought about the seating chart. I thought about the room that was given away to Victoria's in-laws. I thought about 30 years of being an acceptable sacrifice. You want me? I whispered. Officially? Grace, Eleanor said, reaching across the table to cut my face. We didn't just find a florist for the diner. We found the piece of us that was missing. We want the world to know that if anyone wants to get to you, they have to go through us first, I cried then. Not the jagged, lonely tears of Christmas Eve, but a flood of relief that felt like a baptism. I signed the papers with a shaking hand. A few weeks later, Marcus took me back to that same lookout point over the valley. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and incoming snow. He didn't get down on one knee, he just stood behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and held a small, velvet box in front of my eyes. I don't want to just be the guy who bakes your bread. Grace, he whispered. I want to be the man who builds the table with you. I want to be the person who chooses you first, every single day for the rest of our lives. Will you marry me? The ring was simple, a gold band with a small, raw emerald, the color of the Oregon woods. Yes, I sobbed into his chest. 1,000 times yes, we began planning a winter wedding. Not a grand gold-foiled production, but a ceremony at the hearth. We wanted the walls that had sheltered my healing to witness my joy. But as the date approached, the shadows of the past began to creep back in. I hadn't told my biological family about the adoption or the engagement. The response was an explosion. My mother called within minutes, her voice a screeching siren of indignation. How dare you? Adult adoption? It's an insult. After everything we gave you. You're making us look like monsters in front of the whole town. And a wedding at a diner? With people we don't even know? They aren't people you don't know, Mom, I said, my voice cold and steady. They're my parents. And Marcus is the man who sees me. You're invited as guests if you can be respectful. But the seating chart is already full. The line went dead. As the wedding day drew near, the fear didn't disappear, but it changed. It wasn't the fear of being unwanted anymore. It was the fear of the collision, the moment my old world would try to tear down the one I had built. I stood in my shop looking at my wedding dress, a simple, cream-colored silk, and wondered if I was strong enough to face the people who had spent 30 years telling me I wasn't enough. I looked at the emerald on my finger, glowing in the soft light of the studio. I wasn't the big girl who made things easy anymore. I was a woman who had been chosen, and I was about to find out exactly what happens when a ghost finally decides to speak. I had kept my new life in a beautiful, fragile bubble. You have to tell them, Grace, Marcus said one night as we were addressing invitations to our small circle of friends. Not because they deserve to know, but because you deserve to stand in your truth. If you keep it a secret, you're still letting them have power over you. He was right. I sent a simple factual email to my mother, father, and Victoria. I told them I was engaged, that I was getting married in December, and that I had been legally adopted by Eleanor and Henry. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't ask for them to attend. I just stated it as a fact of my existence. The morning of the wedding, the air was brittle and silver with frost. The hearth had been transformed. I had spent the previous night draping the wooden rafters in eucalyptus, white roses, and thousands of tiny, warm fairy lights. The smell was intoxicating, sweet, earthy, and full of promise. I stood in the small back office, looking at myself in the antique mirror Eleanor had brought from her home. The cream silk of my dress felt like a second skin. I didn't look like the woman who had cried on her kitchen floor a year ago. My posture was different. My shoulders were square, and my eyes held a clarity that only comes from surviving a fire. You look like a queen. Grace, Eleanor whispered, stepping in. She was wearing a deep plum velvet dress, her silver hair pinned back with a sprig of the jasmine I'd grown for her. She reached out and smoothed my hair, her touch steady. Ready, ready, I said. But my heart skipped a beat as the front door chimes rang. I didn't expect them to come. I truly didn't. But as the ceremony was about to begin, The heavy oak doors swung open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. My mother, Linda, marched in, draped in an expensive faux fur coat, followed by my father, who looked like he wanted to vanish, and Victoria, who was visibly pregnant, and looking around the diner with a smirk of practiced pity. They didn't sit in the back. They marched right to the front row, where Henry and Eleanor were already seated. "Grace, stop this nonsense," my mother hissed as I reached the end of the aisle where Marcus stood. The music, a soft acoustic guitar, faltered. The guests went silent. "This has gone far enough. Legal adoption? At your age? It's a public embarrassment. We are your family. We are your blood." Marcus stepped forward, his hand instinctively reaching for mine, but I squeezed his fingers and stepped out in front. "This was my battle. You are my DNA, Mom," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of the room. It was the sound of a stone hitting a still lake. "But for 30 years, you weren't my family. Family is the seat at the table that is never too full. Family is the phone call that doesn't get cut short for a caterer. Family is the people who saw me when I was invisible." "We gave you everything," Victoria chimed in, clutching her belly as if it were a shield. "We let you into our lives. We shared our home. You let me hover," I corrected her, using the word that had haunted me since that Christmas. "I was the background noise to your life, Victoria. I was the one who did the flowers for your wedding for free while Mom told me there wasn't enough room for me to eat. The dinner I helped decorate." Looked at my father. He was staring at his shoes, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Dad," I said softly. "Look at me." He slowly raised his eyes. They were filled with that same old, tired kindness, the kind that never actually did anything. "I loved you the most," I told him, and I felt a stray tear escape. "Because I thought your silence meant you were hurting with me. But your silence was just a choice to let me drown so you wouldn't have to make waves. You chose your comfort over your daughter. And that is why these people," I gestured to Eleanor and Henry, "are my parents now. Because when I was drowning, they didn't just watch. They jumped in." "This is ridiculous," Linda snapped, grabbing my father's arm. "We're leaving. If you go through with this, Grace, don't you dare call us when this little fantasy falls apart. You'll have nothing." "I already have everything," I said. I turned my back on them. It was the hardest and easiest thing I had ever done. I looked at Marcus, whose eyes were shining with a fierce protective pride. I looked at Eleanor and Henry, who were standing now, their faces etched with a love that was earned, not assigned. The door slammed behind my biological family. The sound echoed, then faded. The silence that followed wasn't hollow. It was clean. It was the silence after a fever breaks. "Please," I said to the musician, my voice steady again. "Continue." As the guitar started up again, I took Marcus's hands. We didn't rush. We said our vows in front of the people who actually knew our hearts. When the minister pronounced us husband and wife, and then officially acknowledged the adoption, the cheer that went up from the small crowd was deafening. Henry hugged me so hard. I thought my ribs might crack. "I've got you, daughter," he whispered into my hair. "Always." The confrontation hadn't been the tragedy I feared. It was the final cord being cut. As we danced that night on the checkered linoleum floor of the diner, surrounded by the scent of roses and wood smoke, I realized that truth doesn't just set you free, it clears the table so the right people can finally sit down. Sat in the glow of the fairy lights, watching my new father and my new husband laugh together. The ghosts were gone, and for the first time the room was exactly the right size. The weeks following the wedding felt like the first deep breath after a long underwater swim. The chaos of the confrontation had settled, leaving behind a profound crystalline peace. I no longer woke up with that phantom tightness in my chest, wondering who I had disappointed, or whose seating chart I was ruining. One snowy afternoon in late January, I sat at the window of the newly finished floral corner of the hearth. The smell of Marcus's rosemary focaccia drifted from the kitchen, mingling with the scent of the fresh winter jasmine I was arranging. Thick envelopes sat on the table. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. It was from my father. I opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, written on the yellow legal pad paper he always used for his work notes. "Grace, I've sat down to write this 10 times. I saw you at the wedding. I really saw you. You looked like you were finally breathing. I realized then that for 30 years, I've been holding my breath too. I'm sorry I didn't speak up. I'm sorry I let peace become a substitute for love. Your mother doesn't understand, and she probably never will. She calls it a betrayal. But I think deep down I know it was a survival. I've enclosed a check. It was the money we'd saved for your future wedding that your mother said we should use for Victoria's new nursery. I took it out of the account. It's yours. Buy something for your shop. Build your life. I don't expect you to call, but I wanted you to know that I finally see the woman you became. Even if I wasn't the man who helped you get there, love. Dad, I looked at the check. It was a significant amount, but it wasn't the money that made my hands shake. It was the acknowledgement. The ghost had finally seen the person. I didn't cry. I just folded the letter and put it in my desk drawer. I didn't feel the need to rush back to him, to forgive him instantly, or to fold back into the family dynamic. The check would go toward the down payment on the small cottage Marcus and I had found near the lake, a house with an extra bedroom and a sunroom for a studio. Boundaries aren't walls. They're the gates that decide who gets to walk in. My father had sent a letter over the gate, and that was enough for now. By March, the Floral Cafe was a local sensation. People came for the bread but stayed for the atmosphere. I taught workshops on Saturday mornings, showing women how to find beauty in imperfect stems. I often saw Eleanor sitting in the back, watching me with a look of such pure, maternal pride that it made my heart ache in the best way possible. Then came the morning. I stood in our small bathroom at 6 a.m., staring at a plastic stick with two faint, pink lines. The world seemed to go silent. I walked into the kitchen where Marcus was drinking coffee, the sunrise casting long golden shadows across our wooden table. I didn't say a word. I just laid the test down next to his mug. Marcus looked at it. Then he looked at me. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the floor, and pulled me into an embrace that felt like the foundation of a skyscraper, unshakable and deep. We're going to need a bigger table, he whispered into my neck. No, I said, pulling back to look at him, my eyes shining. The table we have is exactly the right size. We'll just keep adding chairs. We told Eleanor and Henry that night over a dinner of pot roast and laughter. Henry cried, the first time I'd ever seen him do so, and Eleanor immediately began talking about the nursery at their house, insisting that a grandchild of the hearth would need a proper cradle. As the spring turned into a lush, green summer, my body began to change, and so did my perspective. I found myself writing letters to my unborn child in the quiet hours of the morning. You will never be a backup, I wrote. You will never have to earn your seat. You are chosen before you even arrive. You will take up as much space as you need, and we will move the mountains, just to make sure you can see the sun. Healing isn't a destination. It's a practice. It's the way I chose Marcus every morning. It's the way I let Eleanor hold my hand when I felt overwhelmed. It's the way I finally looked at my reflection and didn't see a shadow. I was no longer the girl who wasn't invited. I was the woman who had built her own house, planted her own garden, and invited the whole world to the feast. The sun is setting over the Oregon hills, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and honey gold. I am sitting on the porch of our cottage, the one we bought with the money my father sent and the dreams Marcus and I baked into reality. My daughter, Ilara, named for the woman who taught me what a mother's shadow should actually feel like, cool, protective, and vast, is fast asleep in the bassinet beside me. I look at her tiny, perfect hands, and I realize she will never know the coldness of a room that doesn't have a place for her. She will never know the hollow ache of being the flexible one. She is the center of a world that was built specifically to hold her. I think back to that Christmas Eve, standing in the sleet, feeling like my soul was being erased by a seating chart. It feels like a lifetime ago, or perhaps a story I read about someone else. But I carry that girl with me. I keep her tucked safely inside my heart. And every time I pull out a chair for a stranger at the diner, or every time I tell Eleanor I love her, I am whispering to that younger version of myself, see? I told you we'd find home. Legacy isn't what you inherit from people who didn't know how to love you. Legacy is the culture you create in the vacuum they left behind. It's the warmth of the bread, the scent of the jasmine, and the ironclad rule that in this family, no one is ever too much. I've learned that the hardest part of being the scapegoat or the invisible child isn't the exclusion itself. It's the lie you start to believe. The lie that you are fundamentally unlovable. But the truth is simpler and much more beautiful. Some people are just blind to the light right in front of them. Their inability to see you doesn't make you invisible. It just makes them dark. I watched Marcus walk up the path, his apron tucked under one arm, carrying a bag of fresh rolls in a single, Wild sunflower he'd picked near the lake. He kisses the top of my head, then leans over to watch our daughter breathe. The diner was full tonight, he says softly. But we saved a spot for the music tomorrow. I smile, leaning my head against his shoulder. The table is full. My heart is full. And for the first time in my life, I am not waiting for the other shoe to drop. I am exactly where I was always meant to be. If you're watching this and you've been the scapegoat of your family, if you've been told you're too much or too sensitive or always causing drama just because you dared to ask to be treated fairly, I want you to know something. It's not you. It never was. You deserve to be chosen. Not as a backup, not as a last resort, not as the acceptable sacrifice when someone else's comfort is at stake. Chosen first. Chosen fully. Chosen without conditions. Family isn't blood. Family is an obligation. Family isn't people who share your DNA but treat you like a burden. Family is the people who show up. The people who see you crying alone and invite you to their table. The people who open their hearts and their homes and make you officially, permanently, undeniably theirs. I spent 30 years trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it. And then I spent 3 years learning what love actually looks like. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. It helps more people find these stories when they need them most. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to set boundaries with your own family? Share your experience in the comments. I read every single one. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing how far this story reaches. And if you want more stories like this, check the description. I've linked some of my favorites there. Until next time, remember, you deserve to be chosen.